I don't think the youngsters do this anymore. When I was a kid, you could make clubs. We'd make clubs and little club houses and make them out of boxes and pieces of junk wood and things like that. You make them in the backyard or wherever. Secret handshakes and secret knock to get into the club. The really fancy kids, they got tree houses. The dads were good at building things. They make them a tree house. But you didn't just go into somebody's tree house. Come on. There, you had to know, like, you had to be invited. You had to know the knock or the language or whatever. And the little club thing was kind of a way to prop yourself up, make you feel included with your own little tribe of people. But it was also kind of mean because in order to include people, you had to exclude people. And I think that's probably why clubs are maybe sort of now discouraged. I really like the impulse in the West toward inclusivity as a principle. Hey, we all share this space. We all share this planet. We can do it. We can figure out how to live at peace with each other. I love that. The execution right now, the execution for the last 10-ish years, I don't think that's it, but I'm optimistic we can get it figured out and that we can do well together for a very, very long time, even if we don't ultimately all end up thinking the same stuff about God or politics or whatever. It's an interesting feature of the moment we live in, though, that notion of tolerance and pluralism, living together in a very diverse community. That's a very now thing. That wasn't super a thing back in the ancient world. That is until Persia came along. And yesterday we're talking about Cyrus the Great in the early part of his reign in the 530s BC. And I think more for expedient reasons than for human rights reasons, Cyrus the Great comes along. He's like, you know what? I'm going to set a whole bunch of captives free, including these Jewish people. And I think he believed it would be much easier to govern an empire as expansive as the one that he was putting together by letting people have a degree of autonomy. And I think he felt he could maintain peace better by allowing people to worship their own gods and whatnot. And indeed, it was a badge of honor for future kings to point to their armies and be like, look, they're all different. They dress different. They're from all different parts of the world. Also, that tolerance results in a whole bunch of different looking people all being willing to kill at my command. So, like I said, it's not a progressive, modern, liberal, Western democracy we're talking about here, but it was the first little splash in history that I see of something that looks fairly cosmopolitan with a lot of different cultures and people and everything coming together. And so we see that impulse, or the beginning of it, coming onto the scene with the conquest of Cyrus the Great in the 540s, 530s. But we see the exact opposite impulse on the part of the Jewish people. They get even more exclusive at this time, and we see that in the book of Ezra. In fact, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, those are the three final historical books of the Old Testament that all deal with this era in Persia that we're talking about. Ezra and Nehemiah both put a lot of emphasis on this need for the Jewish people to be a little bit exclusive, to have a club, to put a sign on the door. It's like no outsiders allowed, and you got to know the secret knock. And we have registers and rolls and stuff, and if you haven't signed up in our registers and rolls, I'm sorry, you have no part in our inheritance. It's very, very exclusive. And as a result, what we see next in this story of the Jews in Persia leading up to the climax of the story, which I think is in the book of Esther, what we see next feels a little bit jarring given our modern sensibilities about inclusion and not making clubs and not having secret knocks. So in Ezra chapter 1, we see this beautiful gift of generosity given to the Jewish people. Cyrus comes along and he's like, I am great and tolerant, and I will let you go, and I will give you back all of your money and your stuff, and everybody has to give you money and stuff. Go forth and build your thing. Now, in the New Testament mindset, you would think like, oh, you've been the recipient of forgiveness, like that one parable of Jesus where that guy owes a ton of money and he can't pay it back and he begs for forgiveness, and the benevolent king is like, I forgive you. Here's all your stuff. You're forgiven. Your debt is forgiven. And the guy's like, that's amazing. But then somebody owes him just a few dollars and he goes and chokes that guy. And he's like, you got to give me all of that. I'm super angry at you. And the parable demonstrates the man's hypocrisy. Well, on one level, we look at Ezra chapter 1 and we see the Jews are the recipients of this generous, wonderful gift. And then we go to chapter 2 and we see that they're very, very exclusive and they're not giving away the gift they got to anybody else. On the one hand, we could look at that and be like, this is totally in violation of the principles of Jesus in the New Testament. But on the other hand, We also got to think about this from the perspective of the very damaged at this point in history Jewish people. And we got to think about the trauma. And that word gets thrown around a lot, homies. People are saying that one left and right now. Trauma, toxic, that one gets thrown around a lot too. Most of the time when I hear people say that and then I hear what they describe, I'm like, I don't know if that actually counts. This is cultural trauma, what the Jews went through. This is legit. They got practically exterminated. They got their entire civilization destroyed. They got transplanted. They're forced to be subservient. And I mean, they're on the fast track to being completely eliminated from history. So they've been through some stuff. Cyrus lets them go back. And on that long walk back, and in the weeks leading up in preparation to make this unexiled trip from Persia back to Jerusalem, Babylon back to Jerusalem, they got to be thinking real hard to themselves. How did we screw this up? How did we get here? And how do we not make the exact same mistakes again? And it looks like reading Ezra and Nehemiah and maybe a little bit in Esther and reading some of the prophets that the conclusion was that what went wrong is we just acted like everybody else. We treated God like he was a pagan god and like he would behave like a pagan god. We married people who didn't believe the same stuff and weren't from these tribes of the promise. And as a result, they apparently concluded our ideas got watered down. We compromised on those things. We were not a people set apart exclusively for God. And gradually, we looked just like everybody else. And it was a bad way to live. It was a bad way to function. And we got what we deserved. But God is giving us this second chance. And so we're going to follow God more devoutly. And it looks like they also decide we're going to be much more exclusive right now because we just can't adopt any of these outsider pagan ideas. It sounds weird, right? Like, to listen to me spell that out, don't you feel some kind of tension, some kind of conflict? And on the one hand, I mean, I tried to do my best to make their argument make sense and sound good. But on the one hand, the argument of saying, let's look at what we got wrong and let's not do that anymore. And then saying we're supposed to be a very unique people set apart from God, and we didn't do that, and we need to do that when we have this fresh chance. That sounds really good. But on the other hand, you have all of the values of right now, which again, I would argue are good at their heart, fumbling in their execution, about inclusion and how we function together as a people. And literally, I mean, come on, let's just say it. The one completely agreed upon thing morally in this very weird moral moment in which you and I live is that being an exclusive racist is bad. Everybody understands that being a racist is bad. And everybody understands that being the kind of person who excludes everybody else is bad, unless it's one of the fashionable exclusions. And again, I would just offer my caveat that I really like the impulse of inclusion and tolerance that we have going on right now. The execution of it is not that impressive and has problems. And there are certain people it would seem that you're allowed to get after more than others. We'll get it dialed. Well, I hate to break it to you, but the further you read into Ezra chapter 2, and really Ezra and Nehemiah in general, the more you're going to feel this tension. It doesn't go away because these books are leaning hard into the idea of the Jews saying we have got to exclusive it up way more. So chapter 2 reads like the genealogies of yore in the older parts of the Old Testament. It's almost like we're back in the book of Numbers here, where we're celebrating this family, this tribe. Like, look, it's still there. It's still intact. 10 of the tribes are gone, but 2 of them, Judah and Benjamin, they're still there, and God's going to build something out of this remnant. There's an excitement to that in this list of names that dominates Ezra chapter 2. And this is how it reads, chapter 2, verse 1. Now these are the people of the province who came up from the captivity of the exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken captive to Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town, in company with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, I don't know if I said that name right, Reliah, I don't know if I said that name right, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Bana. Man, that was difficult. The list of the men of the people of Israel, and then it just gets harder after that. And it goes through and it lists the families, including the men of Bethlehem. I think it's kind of a big deal that Bethlehem gets singled out in this more or less one one-page, one-chapter list of the heads of these households who went back. Some of these people are described as being priests, some as Levites, some as temple servants, some as just families without any particular title. But it was very important to Ezra to list that these were the people in the records. Know the people who saw the opportunity that God said, now's your chance. I'm going to have Cyrus give you an opening. Take it. These are the people who were faithful. These people, I think in the mind of the author of Ezra, are the ones who did not wander around metaphorically in the desert like the people after the Exodus. These are the ones who went and did the right thing at the right time, and they didn't have 40 years wandering around. They went right back and started doing what they were supposed to do, or at least that was the goal. More on that in just a minute. But get this, the end of chapter 2 shows us that really right from the beginning, there were some problems with who were the holders of this inheritance and who might be interlopers or coattail riders who were trying to grab onto this, to grab the favor of Cyrus, even though they had never really ever been a part of the plight that the Jewish people had truly gone through. There's some questionable genealogies that get described here at the end of chapter 2. The following came up from the towns of Tel Melha, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Adon, and Immer, but they could not show that their families were descended from Israel. So there are a bunch of other people who are like, we understand ourselves to be descended from Israel. We would like to go along with you. But then it goes on to say these families, and it names a bunch of them, searched for their family records, but they couldn't find them. So they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. And then chapter 2 wraps up saying in total, there were 42,360 people who went, besides their 7,300 manservants and maidservants. And they also had 200 men and women singers. They had 736 horses and 245 mules and 435 camels and 6,720 donkeys. And that's how many people went. And when they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave free will offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. So it's a mixed bag. It's a motley crew of people and animals making this second exodus, if you will, here in Ezra chapter 2. And it's not perfect. We're not even sure that everybody who's on this trip is completely of Israel. Some of them look like they're allowed to participate anyway. But the impulse we're seeing is that the Jews are thinking in terms of strict boundaries. We need to be a people set apart for God, and they've got a strategy for how to do it, and it's with this ethnic record-keeping stuff. We'll learn more about how that plays out next time around and how that affects the ultimate rebuilding of the temple and following through on the opportunity God has given them through the edict of Cyrus the Great. All of this in service of understanding the story that we're going to get into in the book of Esther real soon, that much better. Did you anticipate that we were going to get to look at a little bit of Ezra and a little bit of Nehemiah as well? That would just be bonus stuff when you signed up for Esther? Either way, I hope it's been a pleasant surprise. I'm enjoying it. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.